She married her daughter to a Protestant to bring peace, then ordered 10,000 of them killed. In the shadows of a royal wedding, Catherine de' Medici turned celebration into slaughter. Children were ripped from their beds, bodies dragged through the blood-soaked streets. She did not wield the sword, she whispered to those who did. This is the story of France's Queen Mother and the massacre she orchestrated. Catherine de' Medici was not born to rule France. She was born into uncertainty, into a city of silk, whispers, and shifting allegiances. On April 13, 1518, Florence did not rejoice at the birth of Caterina Maria Romula di Lorenzo de' Medici. She was a girl after all, and worse, a Medici girl in a time when that name sparked both awe and hatred. Her father, Lorenzo III de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, was a temporary prince, powerful by papal grace but politically fragile. Her mother, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, was French nobility, rich in bloodline but tragically brief in life. Within weeks of her birth, both her parents were dead. Smallpox, poison, politics. The cause is debated, but the result was the same. Catherine was left alone in a palace that now felt like a tomb. She became property, not in law, but in practice. Raised by nuns, passed between relatives like a valuable but inconvenient heirloom, she lived in a world where love was conditional and safety was temporary. Her uncles, Pope Leo VI and later Pope Clement VII, saw her not as a child to protect, but as a diplomatic asset to be placed. She was educated thoroughly, yes, schooled in Latin, philosophy, dance and religion, Japan, but always with the intention that she would one day be used. Her intelligence was noted. So was her obedience. But in corridors where men spoke of kingdoms, Catherine had learned silence. She listened. The political climate of Italy was a boiling pot, and young Catherine floated in it like a leaf. In 1527, Florence erupted in rebellion against the Medici rule. Catherine, barely 8, was taken hostage by anti-Medici forces, held for over 2 years in dangerous conditions, sometimes in convents, sometimes in tower prisons. The rebels threatened to parade her naked through the streets. They threatened to kill her if the Pope intervened. She was a child, but her life had already become currency in the games of power. Eventually she was released, and Pope Clement VII acted swiftly. He needed to secure her position and remove her from Italy. So in a marriage arranged with the cold logic of papal diplomacy, Catherine was betrothed to Henry, Duke of Orleans, the second son of King Francis III of France. She was 14. She had never seen France. She did not speak the language, but she went, cloaked in silk stitched with Medici gold, to a country that barely concealed its contempt for her. The French court saw her as Italian, foreign, insignificant, a merchant's daughter elevated above her station. The king tolerated her, the nobles mocked her, and her new husband, Henry, ignored her. From the moment they met, Henry made it clear that she was not the one he loved. His heart belonged to another, Diane de Poitiers, a woman 20 years his senior, beautiful, cunning, and impossibly powerful. Diane controlled Henry's affection, his politics, even his wardrobe. Catherine was merely the official wife, a necessary vessel for producing heirs. But that was a problem. For 10 long years, Catherine could not conceive. The court whispered. The doctors blamed her womb. Some even whispered that God had cursed her. The king considered annulment. Had she been discarded then, history might have forgotten her entirely. But Catherine endured. She survived humiliation, isolation, and fear of exile. And in 1504, after a decade of childlessness, she gave birth to a son. Then another. Then another. 10 children in total, though many would die young. Her place was secured, not through affection, but through fertility. Still, even as she bore princes and princesses, Catherine remained in the shadows. She dressed in black. She kept her voice low. She played the game of survival in a foreign court where every gesture could be misread and every smile might be sharpened by jealousy. But behind her quiet eyes, something was forming. A steel resolve, a patience honed by years of neglect. When Henry VII became king in 1547, Diane de Poitiers remained his closest companion. Catherine was queen, but in name only. She was excluded from state affairs, left to host banquets and produce heirs. She waited, she watched, and when, in 1559, Henry died in a jousting accident, his eye pierced by a splintered lance, everything changed. Diane was banished, and Catherine finally stepped into the light. But the light was not kind. Her son Francis II, barely 15, was weak and dominated by the Guise family. Catherine became regent in all but name, and thus began her true education, in war, in faith, in betrayal. He had been a pawn. Now she would learn to become the board itself. When Catherine de' Medici lost her husband, she did not lose power. She gained it, but not by claiming the throne. That was never an option for a woman in 16th century France. Instead, she positioned herself where no one could remove her, behind it. Her son, Francis II, was crowned in 1559. He was 15, sickly, easily manipulated, and married to Mary, Queen of Scots, a woman wrapped in Catholic ambition and flanked by the powerful House of Guise. Catherine, now the Queen Mother, was politically outnumbered. But she was not outmanoeuvred. She made no bold declarations. She did not shout in court. She did not demand titles or strip her enemies of theirs. Instead, she became indispensable. She offered calm in the storm. And in a time when every noble family was scheming, Catherine made herself the one person who could balance the scale, even as she quietly tipped it. When Francis II died just a year later, Catherine did not weep publicly. She moved. Charles IX, her 10-year-old son, became king, too young to rule, perfect. Now officially regent, Catherine had the authority she once sought, and the perfect excuse to wield it. She cloaked her decisions in the language of motherhood, presenting herself not as an autocrat, but as a concerned mother seeking only the good of France. But France in reality was crumbling. Religious tensions had already begun to rot the foundations of the kingdom. On one side, the Catholic majority, powerful, backed by Rome, but deeply fractured by rival families. On the other, the Huguenots, French Protestants, increasingly bold, supported by reformers abroad and nobles at home. And in the middle, Catherine. She did not side with the Protestants out of love for reform. She did not embrace the Catholics out of piety. She chose power. Whichever side allowed her to maintain control she favoured, but only for as long as it suited her. She held court like a stage manager, orchestrating meetings, alliances, treaties, then quietly unravelling them when they grew too strong. She invited Protestant leaders to the Louvre, spoke of peace, smiled with restraint, and then dispatched spies to record their movements. She offered favours to Catholics, funded their ventures, then delayed their demands until frustration turned inward. Catherine's mastery was not in ruling with force, but in ruling through fear and favour. She rarely said no directly. She said, "Not yet, let me think," or "We must be cautious." She wrapped daggers in velvet and handed them out like gifts. The court she governed was not one of laws, but of whispers. She brought with her a retinue of Italian advisors, scholars, alchemists, physicians, astrologers. The French nobility viewed them with suspicion, calling them sorcerers, poisoners, manipulators. But Catherine knew what the whispers did not. That power in the 16th century was not just held, it was felt. And to make people feel her presence, she had to haunt the edges of their comfort. She wore black, not out of mourning, but as a constant symbol of seriousness, restraint, and danger. She moved silently through halls, appearing behind doors, standing at balconies, her eyes unreadable. Some courtiers claimed they had seen her appear when no one had announced her. Others whispered that she never slept. But Catherine did sleep. She dreamed of unity under her terms. And to achieve it, she raised her sons to become kings she could control. Charles IX was impressionable, emotional, easily swayed. Catherine surrounded him with advisors loyal to her. She read every document before it reached his hands. She coached his speeches, she manipulated his friendships, and she made sure every voice he heard echoed hers. She tried the same with her younger son Henry, more intelligent, more proud, more difficult. She sent him to command armies, to be admired by soldiers, to be praised by generals, but never to stray too far from her orbit. Catherine ruled not through titles, but through dependency. She made her sons believe they needed her, politically, emotionally, spiritually. And when they resisted, she reminded them of their weakness, their youth, their enemies. France became a house of cards built on wet stone, the monarchy jihadingly fragile, the court splintered with ambition, the countryside littered with uprisings, mutinies, and religious violence. Catherine responded with measures she called necessary. She established networks of informants, secret police, coded messages. She ordered arrests quietly and trials quickly. She funded Catholic armies to subdue Protestant towns. She sent letters to Protestant nobles promising reconciliation while preparing soldiers for their arrival. She was not bloodthirsty in the way generals are. She did not crave death. She craved control. And if control required death, so be it. By the mid-1560s, Catherine had created a political environment in which no one trusted anyone, and everyone feared her. She was mother to the king, advisor to the regent, architect of alliances, broker of war. To some, she was a stabilizing force in a collapsing nation. To others, she was a spider in the center of a vast web, weaving silk from lies and strings from threats. But to herself, she was France, and France would obey. Catherine de' Medici was not a queen who bled her enemies on the battlefield. She preferred silence to swords. And if power could be slipped into a goblet, sewn into silk, or breathed through perfume, then it was all the more useful. From the moment she entered the French court, Catherine was followed by rumours. They called her the Italian, not as a compliment, but as a warning. To the French nobles, Italy meant alchemy, deception, foreign gods, foreign poisons. It meant secrets they didn't understand and therefore feared. Catherine brought with her not just advisors, but chemists, perfumers, astrologers, and men whose professions were never clearly named. They came from Florence, Venice, and Naples. They came with herbs, powders, and tinctures, and soon the French court began to change. Sudden deaths became more common, not among peasants, but among nobles. A duke collapsed after a feast, foam on his lips. A bishop died in his bed, his skin covered in blue blotches. A noblewoman miscarried after wearing a gifted ring for 3 days. No one could prove anything. The physicians shrugged, the clergy prayed, but behind every tragedy there was always a whisper. Was Catherine behind this? She never answered. She didn't need to. She understood something deeply medieval, yet timeless. That fear was most effective when it came wrapped in uncertainty. If people feared your hand but could not see it move, they would stop reaching for the knife. Stories began to grow, first in salons, then in pamphlets, then in embassies, that Catherine had built a secret poison room at Château de Chaumont, that she employed Italian apothecaries to craft untraceable toxins, that her gowns were lined with deadly powder and her gloves infused with skin-burning oils, that she hosted dark masses with astrologers, sacrificing animals to predict the death of her rivals, that her dining table had hidden mechanisms to deliver poisoned wine with the flick of a finger. Most of it was exaggeration. Some of it was invented by her enemies, but not all of it. She did, in fact, keep an astrologer, Cosimo Ruggieri, close to her for decades. She consulted horoscopes before major political decisions. She kept a private collection of rare herbs and substances from distant lands. And she certainly surrounded herself with men and women who knew more about the body than the average doctor. She may not have poisoned her enemies with her own hands, but she knew who could. There are accounts, conflicting but persistent, of strange deaths that always seemed to benefit Catherine. Louis de Condé, a Protestant leader, was executed under suspicious timing. Coligny, another Huguenot, survived an assassination attempt only to be killed days later in a riot. Catherine herself may have set in motion. Other nobles simply vanished or fled the country in fear. Some say Catherine's true genius was not poison, but timing. She knew exactly when to smile, when to stall, and when to let others carry out the act while her hands remained clean. And if they acted cruelly, well, she could always express horror, shake her head, and promise reform. She had become a master at displacing blame. Even the architecture of her palaces seemed to play into the myth. There were rooms with hidden panels, corridors that led nowhere, staircases that creaked in code. Visitors spoke of a chill in the air when Catherine passed, of the scent of roses in rooms where no flowers had been laid, and always the gloves. Catherine was known for her love of gloves, richly embroidered, soaked in perfume, rarely removed. According to legend, she once had a pair made for a rival noblewoman, lined with a tincture of belladonna and arsenic. The woman wore them at court. She danced once, she never danced again. Whether or not the glove ever existed doesn't matter. What matters is that people believed it could. Catherine never had to kill. She simply had to convince everyone that she could and would, if necessary. Yet it would be too simple to call her a poisoner in the classic sense. She was not an assassin. She was a tactician of fear. a queen who understood the performance of power. She did not parade her might. She let others imagine it, magnify it, recoil from it, and that was far more effective than any blade. The French court became a theatre of anxiety. Allies looked over their shoulders. Enemies second-guessed their attacks, and Catherine stood at the centre of it all, dressed in black, silent, still, watching. She did not raise armies, but she raised questions. She did not lead charges, but she led rumours. She did not spill blood on the marble floors. She let others mop it up for her. And in the flickering candlelight of court banquets and funeral processions, her legend grew, not as a saint, not even as a queen, but as a presence, a question no one could answer, a shadow no one could pin down, the Queen of Poisons, the Black Widow of France, the Architect of Whispers, and the Whisper itself. By the late 1550s, France was no longer a kingdom. It was a battlefield waiting to declare itself. The tension between Catholics and Huguenots, French Protestants emboldened by Calvinist theology and foreign allies, had escalated beyond insults, beyond pamphlets, beyond even political debate. Now it lived in the streets, in the churches, in the homes of ordinary people who locked their doors at night not against thieves, but against their neighbours. It would be easy to blame the bloodshed on the people. On the priests who declared Protestantism heresy, or the preachers who called Catholicism idolatry, on the nobles who raised private armies, or the peasants who stormed parishes with torches. But France did not slip into civil war by accident. It was pushed, and one of the hands doing the pushing, deliberately, strategically, and always behind silk curtains, was Catherine de Medici. To Catherine, religious division was not a tragedy. It was an opportunity. She did not believe deeply in the doctrines of Rome or Geneva. What she believed in was monarchy, stability, order, her family's continued rule, and if maintaining that power required playing both sides, then she would do so with precision, patience, and complete emotional detachment. At first, Catherine appeared to favour compromise. She hosted religious colloquies, invited Protestant nobles to court, and allowed Protestant princes to speak openly of reform. She extended olive branches that appeared genuine, but they were never rooted in conviction, they were rooted in strategy. By tolerating the Huguenots just enough, Catherine could use them to counterbalance the Guise family, ultra-Catholics who had grown too powerful and too confident. And by occasionally granting the Guises military support, she kept the Protestants in a state of insecurity. Never strong enough to threaten her directly, she ensured no one could win, no one could unify, no one could build an alliance stronger than her grip on the crown. Divide and rule, it was not new, but under Catherine it became an art form. But when the balance slipped, so did the veil. In 1562, in a small town called Wassy, everything exploded. Duke Francis of Guise, acting on what he claimed was a provocation, attacked a Protestant congregation holding a secret service in a barn. Dozens were killed, men, women, children, shot, stabbed, trampled. Some accounts say the Guise soldiers laughed, others say they prayed as they killed. The result was the same, the first open massacre of the French Wars of Religion. And Catherine, regent of France, mother of the king, architect of policy, said nothing. She issued no condemnation. She offered no justice. She did not punish the Guises. She did not comfort the Huguenots. She remained silent and let the rage spread. The silence was not ignorance. It was calculation. Because in the aftermath, when both sides called for action, Catherine did not offer peace. She offered arbitrations, slow, ambiguous, draining negotiations that went nowhere. She let the fury fester, let the factions harden, let the court tremble. Then she moved again. She introduced the Edict of Amboise, a weak peers treaty meant to placate the Huguenots, allowing limited worship under strict conditions. Catholics saw it as betrayal. Protestants saw it as insult. No one saw it as sincere. What it achieved, however, was confusion, and that was the point. For every step toward tolerance, Catherine introduced 2 steps of surveillance. She allowed Protestants to build churches, then place spies at their entrances. She approved noble marriages between Catholics and Huguenots, then ordered her agents to record private conversations during the celebrations. She permitted Protestant pamphlets to be printed, then used the content to issue vague charges of sedition. She promised security to those who laid down arms, and once they disarmed, she arrested them. France became a landscape of broken truces and rehearsed betrayals. Every meeting was a potential ambush, every handshake a signal, every treaty a ticking clock. Catherine's genius was not merely in playing both sides, it was in convincing each that she might be on theirs just long enough to gain their trust, and once she had it, she burned it. Her court became a theatre of absurd diplomacy. One week, Protestant leaders would dine at the royal table, praised for their civility. The next, they would be barred from Paris, accused of sedition. One month, Catherine would invite Protestant theologians to debate bishops in front of the king. The next, she would order their sermons banned. The chaos was not an accident. It was the system. And as France bled, in Béarn, in Rouen, in Orléans, Catherine remained composed. Her letters to foreign ambassadors were cool, restrained, filled with phrases like troublesome incidents, temporary unrest, regrettable necessity. But behind those words was a woman who understood exactly what she was doing. She was not seeking peace, she was seeking obedience. And peace, if it ever came, would be on her terms, with her sons on the throne, her enemies in exile, and her name etched into the bones of every treaty. To the world she still wore the mask of the grieving widow, the careful mother, the wise regent. But by 1565, Catherine de' Medici was no longer a queen of compromise. She was a queen of war, and her kingdom of fractured, furious, unpredictable, was becoming the perfect reflection of her rule. By 1572, Catherine de' Medici was tired of negotiations that led nowhere. The wars of religion had carved France into zones of distrust, with cities shifting loyalties and nobles building private militias under the pretense of faith. The monarchy was cracking under the weight of violence it could no longer contain, and Catherine, ever the tactician, knew the blade had dulled. It was time to offer the enemy a flower, one that looked soft, smelled sweet, and concealed a thorn sharp enough to draw blood before they even realized they had been cut. The plan was brilliant in its elegance and monstrous in its implication. A wedding, not just any wedding, but one that would unite the two sides in symbolic harmony. Her daughter, Marguerite de Valois, a devout Catholic raised in a court of spies, poets, and veiled commands, would marry Henry of Navarre, the young and charismatic Huguenot leader, a prince of ambition and Protestant faith. It would be, on the surface, a gesture of healing, a royal marriage binding two warring factions, an event so grand, so public, so drenched in ceremony that the world would believe France had turned a corner. Ambassadors would cheer. Pope and princes alike would wait to see which way the wind turned. And the Protestants, long treated as enemies, would feel for once welcomed. But that was the illusion. Because beneath the golden lace and corals, beneath the rose petals tossed by courtiers and the Latin prayers echoing through Notre Dame, there was a list, a real handwritten list, of names, of men marked not for celebration but for slaughter. It is still debated today who first drafted the list. Some claim it was Catherine herself, hidden in her study with trusted advisers, eyes scanning the names of Huguenot leaders who had arrived in Paris unarmed, in good faith, for a wedding. Others say it was her son, King Charles IX, enraged after an assassination attempt on Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the Protestant commander who had risen to extraordinary influence over him. Still others believe the Catholic faction of the court, especially the Guise family, pushed for decisive action, and Catherine simply allowed the plan to unfold. But what is clear, and what no one disputes, is that the massacre could not have happened without her knowledge, and very likely her consent. The wedding was held on August 18, 1572. It was grand. Paris glowed. The streets were hung with banners. Foreign dignitaries poured in, heads high, believing they were witnessing a turning point in history. Inside the Louvre, Catherine smiled thinly. Margot, her daughter, is said to have wept in silence before the ceremony, forced to marry a man she did not love, for reasons she was not allowed to question. Henry of Navarre looked radiant, if cautious, his every move watched, every word measured. He had come to this wedding with thousands of Protestant allies, most of them nobles, all of them hopeful. They stayed in Paris after the ceremony, as Catherine intended, to relax, to attend banquets, to negotiate new positions, alliances and peace terms. They were in the capital, among friends, so they believed. Meanwhile, in the royal chambers, messengers moved quietly between rooms. Orders were drafted, guards were positioned, swords were sharpened, gates were locked. Catherine knew the value of spectacle. She knew that killing a few leaders in secret might only enrage the Huguenots, but killing many in public would decimate their will. Not just a blow to the body, but a blow to the mind. A strike so brutal, so overwhelming that resistance would feel like suicide. And so she waited. For the bells, for the night to fall, for the trap to close. What happened next would stain her name in every history book that followed. But in those days before the blood, as she walked through corridors lined with candles and prayer, Catherine said nothing. She smiled at guests, she kissed her daughter on the forehead. She dined in seance with her son, and all the while the list lay ready. The knives were waiting, the bell was coming. To Catherine, this was not cruelty, it was calculus. She saw herself not as a murderer, but as a mother protecting her children, protecting France, protecting the crown that so many wanted to see fall. To her, peace was not born in treaties, it was born in fear, and if the wedding had to become a funeral, then so be it. It would be a royal one, perfectly timed, meticulously choreographed, a massacre in the clothing of a celebration. It is said that even the wine tasted bitter that week, that the birds grew quiet, that the river held its breath, because Paris, dressed in silken hymns, was about to drown in blood, and Catherine de Medici, Queen Mother of France, was still smiling. It began not with a scream but with a sound, a single bell. Just before dawn on August 24th, 1572, as the city still slept beneath a veil of wine, sweat and royal celebration, the bell of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois began to toll. It was not a call to prayer, it was a signal. The massacre had begun. The first blade fell at the house of Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, leader of the Huguenots and a recent confidant of King Charles IX. Just days before, he had survived an assassination attempt, a bullet shattering 2 fingers, grazing his arm. And Catherine had publicly promised justice. But justice was not what waited for him in the dark. Coligny was dragged from his bed, wounded, unarmed, still in pain. He was stabbed repeatedly, his body thrown from a window where it was caught by Catholic mobs below. They mutilated it. They cut off his head, his hands, his genitals. They paraded what was left through the streets. Some say they burned the remains. Others say they hung them at the gallows. The truth may be both, or worse. It was the signal Paris needed. Windows burst open, doors were smashed. Nobles in their nightshirts were torn from their chambers. Children hiding under beds were yanked out by their hair. Mothers were slaughtered beside their infants. Whole families were hacked apart with axes and daggers, their only crime being Protestant in a Catholic city. The city transformed in a matter of hours. Shutters slammed shut. Church bells rang. Streets that once hosted wedding parades now flowed with blood. Bodies piled at intersections. Corpses floated down the Seine. The air, choked with smoke and screams, hung low over the rooftops like a funeral shroud stretched across stone. But this was not a riot. It was organised. It had been planned. The King's Swiss Guards were involved. Royal orders had been signed. The soldiers had names, a list of targeted Huguenot leaders, men who had trusted the crown enough to sleep within its walls. Catherine Medici had ensured they were all present for the wedding, and now she ensured they could not leave. Some tried to escape, a few bribed guards, others dressed as Catholics and crept through the alleys, but the city gates were closed, and the river, once a route of freedom, had become a floating morgue. Marguerite de Valois, the bride herself, later claimed that she had to hide fleeing Protestants in her chambers, her wedding dress de mourure, soaked in blood. Whether this story is true or not, it spread like gospel, because in a city where betrayal had become ritual, even the bridal chamber was no longer sacred. The massacre lasted not hours, but days. The violence spread from Paris to the provinces, to Lyon, Rouen, Orléans, Toulouse, Bordeaux. Everywhere the message had gone ahead. Purge them, strangle them, cleanse the faith. The numbers are still debated. Some say 5,000 died. Others place the number closer to 10,000 or more. Many were never counted. Many were never found. They simply vanished into cellars, rivers, mass graves, or the quiet lies of neighbours who said, "We never saw them," and all of it was done in the name of order. Catherine's order. She later claimed it was preemptive, that the Protestants had been planning a coup. She told foreign envoys that it had been spontaneous. She blamed the people. She blamed the king's rage. She blamed everyone but herself. But too many knew better. Letters from ambassadors tell of her presence in the days before, her discussions, her silences, her calmness. King Charles IX, still young, still impressionable, was said to be tormented after the killings began. He had authorized the first strike, yes, but he had not expected the avalanche. Some said he wept. Some said he screamed, "Kill them all! Kill them all! So none may accuse me." That quote, whether truth or myth, clung to him like smoke. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church in Rome celebrated. Pope Gregory XIII held a Mass of Thanksgiving. He commissioned a medal, struck in honour of the defence of faith. Paintings were ordered. Paris, bathed in blood, became holy ground in the eyes of some, but Europe, the rest of it, recoiled. England horrified, the Dutch enraged. Even Catholic monarchs found the scale difficult to defend. Catherine did not flinch. She walked the corridors of the Louvre with her head high, her black gowns brushing over stone that still smelled of blood. She wrote letters of justification, of sorrow, of restraint, but never of guilt. To her this was not a massacre. It was a necessity. It was a lesson, written in red, to those who dared challenge her sons. It was her signature, sealed not with wax, but with silence. And the bell that had rung from Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, was never punished. It rang again, years later, for other kings, other wars, other marriages. But it would always carry the echo of one night when peace was butchered, when a mother's hand did not shield, but struck, and France would never unhear it. What began in the narrow, winding streets of Paris did not stay there. The massacre that erupted on St. Bartholomew's Day was not a contained burst of royal vengeance, nor a one-night riot that cooled with the dawn. It was a signal, a contagious blaze, fed by fear, fanned by hatred, and legitimized by silence. And when news of the slaughter reached the provinces, it did not carry a message of regret or horror, it carried permission. From the capital, orders were sent. Letters travelled by courier carried not just in parchment, but in intent, suggesting that what had occurred in Paris should be replicated where necessary, that heresy should be cleansed, that peace could only return if Protestant threats were extinguished before they regrouped. In other words, the knives that had already tasted blood were now handed freely to others. In city after city, the pattern repeated itself. In Lyon, Huguenots were lured into public squares and gunned down in front of jeering crowds. In Bordeaux, entire families were marched from their homes, bound and drowned in the Garonne River. Their children tossed into the current like cargo too dangerous to keep. In Rouen, mobs set fire to Protestant workshops, driving survivors into the cathedral only to seal the doors and let the flames finish what the swords had started. The numbers mounted quickly, and yet no official count was ever kept. How do you record a nation's shadow when it stretches across every corner of its land? Estimates from contemporaries and modern scholars alike vary wildly. Some suggest 5,000 dead in Paris, another 5,000 to 7,000 across the provinces. Others believe the number may be closer to 20,000 when accounting for those whose names were never written down. Artisans, peasants, travellers, entire villages erased with no priest left to record the loss. No funerals, no trials, no mourning, just silence. And the slow sinking awareness that France had killed its own and called it justice. And yet, within the royal court there was no apology. There was no retraction. Instead, there was applause, not from the people, but from the altar. In Rome, Pope Gregory XIII was reportedly overjoyed. He ordered a mass of thanksgiving at the sight of Protestant heresy being crushed. He commissioned a medal, minted with pride, bearing the image of an angel wielding a sword standing over the slain and the Latin words, Huguenotorum strages, the slaughter of the Huguenots. He had frescoes painted in the Vatican celebrating the bloodshed. He sent Catherine a congratulatory letter. This was the Vatican's endorsement. This was how deep the fracture ran, not just in France, but across Christendom. In Protestant lands, the reaction was one of shock and rage. In London, Elizabeth I received the news in silence, her famously controlled expression giving way only briefly to a look of visible horror. She knew that if such a massacre could happen in Paris, it could happen in Edinburgh, in Geneva, in Amsterdam. She ordered increased security, she surrounded herself with guards, and she never forgot the message France had sent, that even a wedding, even the promise of peace, could be a trap. Diplomats pulled their ambassadors, princes refused to write to Catherine. Pamphlets flooded Europe, painting her not as a queen mother, but as a serpent, a Jezebel, a Medici witch soaked in Protestant blood. And still Catherine remained unmoved. She issued statements claiming it was not a massacre, but a preemptive strike, that the Huguenots had been plotting a coup, that the crown had acted to preserve stability. She claimed that only a few leaders had been targeted. She insisted that the mob violence was unfortunate but unplanned. No one believed her. The truth was that she had traded legitimacy for fear. And while fear is swift, it is never loyal. The monarchy was now tainted in the eyes of half its subjects. Even loyal Catholics, though initially satisfied, began to question the precedent. If Protestants could be killed without trial, what stopped the crown from turning on anyone who grew inconvenient? Catherine had unleashed something she could no longer contain. She had gambled that horror would bring obedience, that rivers of blood would soak the seeds of rebellion before they could sprout. But blood does not wash away memory, and horror has a way of echoing long after the last body has been buried. In the Protestant imagination, St. Bartholomew's Day became more than an event. It became a symbol of treachery, of Catholic cruelty, of France's moral decay, and at the centre of that symbol stood Catherine de' Medici. Her image was carved into pamphlets with fangs, with poisoned flasks, with blood dripping from her fingers. The Queen Mother became the mother of slaughter. Her name became a warning, her face a ghost that walked through Protestant nightmares for generations. What Catherine had intended as a final blow to chaos had instead shattered Europe's last illusion of trust. And though she still sat on a throne, still held counsel, still moved pieces across her political chessboard, she had become, sir, in the eyes of the world, something else entirely. Not a ruler, not a regent, not even a queen, but a butcher with a crown. The massacre that Catherine de' Medici had set into motion did not end with the dying breath of its final victim. It echoed like a cracked bell tolling long after the strike, reverberating through every corridor of her court, every street of her cities, every chamber of her own uneasy soul. And while she may have believed that the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre would solidify power in her hands, eliminate opposition, unify factions, and cement the Valois throne, the reality, cruel and corrosive, was that she had poisoned the very foundation upon which she stood. France did not grow more stable, it splintered. The kingdom, rather than bowing in submission, flared into even deeper unrest. Provinces that had once tolerated the monarchy began to seethe. Old hatreds, briefly buried under the illusion of royal marriages and scripted peace treaties, now erupted with twice the vengeance. Catherine still held court, still wore black silk with the elegance of a funeral veil that never came off, still offered counsel to her sons, but she no longer controlled them as she once had. The guilt she had planted in her children, especially in her second son Charles IX, began to fester into madness. He had given the order, yes, but he had not expected the screams to reach his window for 3 days and 3 nights. He had not expected the sound of bodies being dragged across the cobblestones to haunt his dreams. He had not expected the prayers of the dying to echo louder than the church bells, and he had not expected to see his own name, and his mother's, spat with venom from the mouths of both Catholics and Protestants alike. Charles began to deteriorate quickly. His health collapsed alongside his mind. He became erratic, consumed by fear and insomnia, haunted by visions of blood-stained sheets and walls that whispered his name. His eyes sunk into shadows, his fingers trembled, and his skin grew pallid. He began to hear voices, and in the dark of his private chambers he reportedly whispered again and again, "What blood, what murderers, what evil counsel I have followed." The evil counsel, everyone knew what he meant, or rather who. Catherine tried to manage him, to soothe his torment, to control the growing cracks in his mind, but Charles was slipping. And the people could see it. The boy king, once pliable and sweet-tempered, had become hollowed, devoured by the consequences of obedience. She had raised him to obey her, and in doing so destroyed him. When Charles IX died in 1574, gasping for breath at the age of just 23, his lungs rotted by tuberculosis, and his conscience pierced by memory, Catherine stood by his deathbed. Oh, she did not weep. If she whispered to him in his final moments, history does not record it. All we know is that his last words, if truly spoken, were not for her. "I am lost. Utterly lost." But Catherine was not finished. Not yet. Her third son, Henry III, returned from Poland, where he had briefly reigned as the elected king, to assume the throne of France. He was sharp-tongued, intelligent, theatrical. and far more suspicious of his mother than either of his brothers had been. He did not need her counsel. He did not crave her affection. He tolerated her presence as a symbol, not a strategist. Catherine tried to advise him, to guide him, to extend her influence into his reign, but Henry was wary. He had grown up watching his mother orchestrate betrayals with elegance. He had learned not just from her lessons, but from her shadows. He kept her at court, but at a distance. She became a fixture, a relic, a statue of power slowly gathering dust. Meanwhile, the kingdom continued to unravel. The Protestants regrouped. They had lost thousands, but they had not lost faith. And now they had martyrs. Every city that had burned became a shrine to injustice. Every name on the massacre list became a symbol of defiance. And Catherine's calculated blow, intended to crush rebellion, had only birthed a new generation of rebels. Inside the court, factions multiplied. The Catholic League, increasingly radical and fanatical, began to distrust the crown for not going far enough. The Huguenots saw every peace offer as a trap, and France, the very country Catherine had sought to rule with a steady hand, now writhed in civil war, not occasional, not regional, but constant and uncontrollable. Even the nobles who once praised her began to murmur. Her alliances, once brilliant, now seemed treacherous. Her pragmatism, once admired, now felt like rot. She had kept the Valois name on the throne, but at what cost? And worst of all, perhaps, was that Catherine began to sense her own isolation. The courtiers who had once bent the knee now bowed to her son. The letters that once flowed in by the dozens grew thinner each month. She could walk through the palace halls and no longer hear her name spoken in reverence, only in caution, or worse, in contempt. She had ruled for decades through 3 sons, through war, famine, plague and betrayal. She had survived every threat, outlived every rival, and stood in the centre of every storm with her hands folded, her voice calm and her mind calculating. But now, at last, she found herself standing on a throne that was no longer hers. Not broken at all, but crumbling, and the dust was already rising. By the final years of her life, Catherine de' Medici had outlived not only her enemies, but the very purpose for which she had wielded power. She had once commanded kings, whispered policy into the ears of popes, danced between daggers and treaties with the grace of a spider tiptoeing through its own web. But by the 1580s, that web was unravelling, strand by strand, and there was no one left to fear the spider any more. Her health was declining. Her influence, once absolute, now moved no faster than her own unsteady hands. She still held an official place in court, still attended councils, still offered opinions that were listened to out of habit, not obedience. But France had changed, and Catherine, who had once changed France, was now only a remnant of its past. Her son Henry III, the last of her boys to sit on the throne, had become increasingly paranoid and erratic. He wore jewels to council meetings, wept in public, surrounded himself with male favourites known for their flamboyance and cruelty. He alienated the Catholic League, alienated the Protestants, alienated his own supporters. And although Catherine tried to warn him, tried to steer him back toward diplomacy, he no longer listened. He had learned treachery too well, and from her. France, meanwhile, was bleeding once again. Religious tensions had not abated. If anything, they had intensified. The Guise family, ultra-Catholic and furious at the crown's indecision, rose against the king. The streets of Paris boiled with unrest. The royal family fled the capital, and Catherine, the woman who had once balanced the kingdom with whispers, now watched it collapse under the weight of louder voices than hers. In her final days, she travelled with the court, her body weakened by illness, her skin paper-thin, her strength vanishing like the loyalty she once commanded. She wrote letters still, clinging to the belief that words could control chaos, but there were fewer answers and fewer allies. She died on January 5th, 1589, at the age of 69 in the Château de Blois, not on a throne, not in a blaze of glory, not in the arms of her children. She died surrounded by silence. No royal procession accompanied her body. No monuments were raised in her honour. No poets sang of her legacy. There were no national days of mourning. No cities were draped in black. Just death, unremarkable, unloved, and strangely appropriate. Her body was placed in the cathedral at Blois, not in Saint-Denis, the sacred burial ground of French monarchs, because Paris was too unstable to accept her corpse. Even in death, she was denied what tradition would have granted any other queen mother. Eventually, years later, her remains were moved quietly to Saint-Denis. But by then, the The dynasty she had spent her life defending was already dust. The Valois line died with her son. Henry III would be assassinated just months after her death, stabbed by a fanatical monk while in the latrine. The very church Catherine had tried to manipulate, to pacify, to appease. In the end, it produced the hand that killed her son. The throne passed not to another Valois, but to the Bourbon line, descendants of the very Huguenot Prince Catherine had once tried to crush. Henry of Navarre, survivor of the wedding massacre, would become King Henry IV of France. And so the greatest irony was carved into history, not with a flourish, but with a smirk. Catherine had built her life around preventing Protestant rule, and yet the first king after her death was a Protestant, one she had invited to Paris with a marriage proposal and nearly murdered with a massacre. The wheel had turned, and it had crushed everything she had tried to preserve. Historians still debate her legacy. Was she a stabilizer? A woman forced to do terrible things to hold a collapsing kingdom together? Was she a schemer? A poisoner and manipulator who sowed chaos for her own ends? Was she simply a product of her time, born into violence, forged by neglect, made cruel by necessity? Or was she something else entirely, and not a monster, not a seizure, but a mirror, reflecting the truth of politics when stripped of illusion? A woman who learned too early that mercy is rarely remembered, but fear is never forgotten. In the end, no monument could contain her contradictions. No eulogy could do justice to the damage she left behind. She was neither saint nor sinner, neither hero nor villain. She was Catherine, Queen Mother of France, daughter of Medici blood and Florentine ghosts, the architect of peace built with bones, the guardian of kings raised with daggers, and when she died the world did not weep, it only whispered, as if afraid she might still be listening. Catherine de' Medici never lifted a sword. She did not stand on battlefields, did not gallop into war, did not shout commands from towers or write manifestos of vengeance. She did not wear armour, she wore veils, black silk, lace gloves, and silence. Yet no one who studies the history of 16th century France doubts that her hands, gloved though they were, left stains that no laundering of history could fully cleanse. She ruled without a crown. She struck without a visible weapon. She survived not by love or loyalty, but by ensuring that no one could move without touching one of her threads. There are those who call her a monster, a Machiavellian mother who sacrificed children, her own and others, for the preservation of a dying dynasty. There are others who insist that she was a realist, a woman born into chaos, orphaned into politics, and married into a country that would never fully accept her. To them she was not cruel, she was necessary. A surgeon in a rotting kingdom carving away disease with a blade no one else had the courage to hold. But even surgeons can cut too deep, and Catherine cut into France with precision so sharp it bled for decades. Her legacy, like her reign, was hidden in shadow. She never gave speeches to cheering crowds, she never inspired poetry or loyalty or love. She was feared, respected, despised, but never adored. She gave France 3 kings and lost them all. She orchestrated alliances that crumbled, treaties that shattered, peace that exploded into civil war. She tried to steer a fractured nation with hands that had once cradled babies, and later scribbled names onto lists that ended in execution. Catherine believed herself the mother of France, but to many she became its stepmother, cold, calculating, foreign in blood and foreign in mercy. And yet the question remains, what would have happened if she had done nothing? Had she stepped aside, had she allowed her sons to rule alone, allowed the nobles to tear each other apart, allowed the fires of religious extremism to burn unchecked, would France have survived the century at all? Would the throne have fallen earlier? Would the wars have been shorter, or even bloodier? Did she destroy France by tightening her grip, or did she delay its destruction by refusing to let go? We will never know, because Catherine de' Medici left behind no confession, no grand defence, no memoir that might have revealed the truth behind her choices. Only letters, cautious, coded, careful. Only decisions, brutal, precise, and unforgettable. Only silence. History often asks us to judge from afar, to sit in the safety of hindsight and pass verdicts on those who navigated storms we can only imagine. But Catherine's story resists easy answers. She was not simply wicked, nor simply wise. She was a woman who learned to move in a world that never made space for her, and so she carved that space herself, even if it bled. She turned weddings into traps, She smiled while signing names that would not survive the week. She buried her children one by one with the same hands that had once guided their rise. So we return finally to the question her story leaves behind. Can a woman save her family by drowning others? Or does the blood always find its way back? Catherine believed in survival. And survive she did, longer than any of the kings she raised, longer than many of the enemies she outplayed. But in the end, she left behind no peace. Only ghosts, only rumours, only sentence, and if you listen carefully, in the cold corridors of French history, in the pages stained with ink and accusation, in the bells that still ring from old Parisian towers, you might still hear her footsteps, soft, measured, and always just out of reach.